Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at another twisted case with you. In this bone-chilling familicide case, we will explore how and why David Brom slaughtered his picture-perfect family with an axe at just 16 years of age. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved Bernard, Paulette, Diane, and Richard Brom, and all those affected by this case. David Francis Brom was born on October 3, 1971, to Paulette and Bernard Brom in Cascade Township, Minnesota. He was the second child in what would become a family of 6. His older brother, Joseph Leonard Brom, known as Joe, was born on June 24, 1969. David's parents then welcomed their first daughter, Diane, on April 10, 1974, and their third son, Richard, known as Ricky, on July 25, 1976. Not much is publicly known about David's upbringing and early life, but he was a good student in high school. His attendance was excellent, his grades were solid B+, and he had positive relationships with his teachers. His Spanish teacher described him as an above-average student, saying he was pleasant, quiet, and they got along well. There were no signs or forewarnings at school indicating what would happen on February 18, 1988. But David's life at home told a different story. He had been suffering from progressive depression, which had emerged over several years and got worse and worse. Medical records show that this even led him to develop suicidal thoughts. To cope with his declining mental health, David tried to mask his pain by making others around him happy. This facade fooled everyone at school, where he was seen as the class clown, always jumping about and saying witty or entertaining things. But in 1987, David attempted to take his own life twice. The first suicide attempt occurred at the end of David's 9th grade year in June 1987, when he was only 16 years old. He tried to hang himself from a tree in the forest near his home, but changed his mind at the last minute. The second attempt happened towards the end of that summer in September. David overdosed on 45 sleeping pills, which he had gotten from a girl who used them for a sleeping disorder. After taking the pills, David got very sick and vomited, telling his parents he had the flu, which they believed. He was deeply serious about ending his life during this second attempt and later felt extremely disappointed that it had failed. David's depression and suicidal thoughts stemmed from a troubled relationship with his family, particularly his father, Bernard. These familial issues got much worse after David's brother Joe left. Joe had begun dressing in a punk style with heavy eyeliner and dark clothes, and his parents hated it. After many arguments about Joe's appearance and lifestyle, his parents eventually kicked him out of the house. Following Joe's eviction, Bernard and Paulette imposed even stricter rules and discipline on David and his younger siblings, seemingly in an attempt to prevent them from adopting a similar lifestyle. The Brom family. David's family was middle class and financially comfortable, and were well respected within their local community. Both parents were very careful about how they are perceived and did not want to be associated with any lifestyle or ideology that might tarnish their reputation. They had a strict curfew, which meant David and his siblings had to do household chores, and they allegedly punished them if they did not do it. While it's not confirmed, there are allegations that David's parents would hit him and his siblings and punish them if they did not do their chores quickly or to their satisfaction. David always sought his father's approval and validation, but found it impossible to achieve. The stricter discipline and the pressure to conform to his parents' standards added to his already unstable mental health. This struggle for acceptance and the increasingly tense home environment must have affected David's deepening depression and deteriorating mental state significantly.
The psychiatrists in this trial have testified that Brom suffers from some form of mental illness, their diagnosis ranging from severe depression to a split personality.
David's father, Bernard, was an engineer at the local IBM plant, while his mother, Paulette, had run a preschool program at their local church until she quit a couple of years before 1988 to spend more time with her kids. Known in the community for her sewing skills and creativity, Paulette was a well-regarded figure, and everyone seemed to like her. The entire family, except Joe, went every Sunday without fail to Pax Christi Catholic Church. The parents even hosted several church meetings at their home, with Bernard using his home computer almost only for church work. From the outside, the Brom family was seen as a model family, respected and admired within the community. The local pastor described David's parents as quiet leaders of the church, well respected by everyone. Neighbors also said there was no indication that something was wrong in the family. But despite this appearance, David silently struggled with serious emotional problems. He believed no adult would understand or take his issues seriously. Along with his thoughts of suicide, a dark seed began to grow in the back of David's mind. A seed that would soon take over with thoughts of murdering his family. David never directly shared these thoughts with his friends, but he hinted at them through a disturbing fantasy about a trip to Florida. He told one friend that in the summer of 1988, he wanted to take a van and go to Florida, where he planned to kill his parents. He also mentioned wanting to take a couple of girls with him, but he didn't specify who, and said he wanted to kill them too. At the time, his friend dismissed these statements as a sick joke, not something to be taken seriously. In another version of this fantasy, David would kill his family, steal the family van and money, and drive to Florida. There, he and two friends would live it up until they ran out of money, at which point David planned to end his life. A classmate later described this plan, saying that David himself and another friend, Angie, had a sort of vacation fantasy. They would add elements to make it more exciting, discussing how they would get to Florida, live off the money they had, get an apartment, and have fun. David said they could get a car by him killing his family. He would then call IBM to inform them of a death in the family, so his father would be taking off a few weeks, ensuring no one would be looking for them. These conversations seemed like harmless, at worst, daydreams to his friends. But they reflected the darker intentions in David's mind, intentions that would eventually lead to tragedy. Patty Price. Before the incident, Patty Price, who grew up with the Brom family, was at the Brom house for a sleepover. Diane Brom, David's sister, had her desk next to Patty's in their homeroom, where 4 desks were pushed together. On the Thursday of that week, Diane didn't show up for school, and it raised some concern among their classmates and teachers because her parents hadn't called in her absence. Rick, Diane's 5th grade brother, was also missing from school, which was unusual since Mrs. Brom, a stay-at-home mom, was typically strict about such things. That evening, Patty went about her day as usual. Her mom was the 8th grade math teacher at her school, and she was laying in the living room that night, working on algebra with her dad, because her mom refused to help with math homework. The atmosphere at Patty's home was calm, which was a direct contrast to what was happening at the Brom household at that time. That Thursday evening, a phone call came in after 8 o'clock, which was unusual in 1988. Patty's mom answered the phone, and it quickly became clear that something was very wrong. Normally a composed person, her mom started crying, which was an unusual and terrifying sound. Patty felt her body stiffen with dread as she sensed the gravity of the situation.
A phone call came in, and it was after 8. And back then in 88, that was not normal to have the phone ring after 8 o'clock at night. And my mom got on the phone, and my mom never cried, and she just started wailing. Like, it was really unusual. And I remember just my body stiffening because that was so unusual. And she hung up the phone and came in, and she just couldn't get words out at first. And she said, Patty, you're going to die. I don't know how to tell you this. But Diane's dead. And my body went from being stiff to being stiffer. And my dad's body completely stiffened around me as well. And from that moment forward, it was like a dark cloud had surrounded me, and I couldn't move. and I did move. I got up. My only sister at home at the time was a senior in high school. And so, and my grandma lived with us at the time too. So all I remember about the rest of that night is we found out the whole family was found murdered. David was missing. David was like an older brother to me.
When her mom finally managed to speak, she struggled to get the words out. "Patty, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice breaking. "Diane is dead." Patty's body went from stiff to completely paralyzed with shock. Her dad was lying beside her, who was also tensed up. Her oldest sister, a high school senior, and her grandma were also at home. That night, the family learned that the entire Brom family had been murdered, and David was missing. David, who had been like an older brother to Patty, had just gone cross-country skiing with her and Diane the previous Sunday. He was a super nice kid, which made the news even more baffling. The next morning, Patty went to school, and walking into St. Pius felt surreal, like entering a ghost town. Everyone was eerily quiet. Patty first passed Ricky's 5th grade classroom, where she saw people but heard nothing. In the 8th grade hallway, Diane's chair was still on her desk, placed there by the cleaners. Patty and another friend cleaned out Diane's desk. As for David, Patty was convinced he had either been kidnapped or had escaped, not yet knowing the full extent of the horror that had unfolded. That morning, David told a friend that he had killed his family. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but his friends always thought he was joking, never imagining he could actually do something so terrible. But the police were called after the rumor reached the school staff. When they arrived at the Brom family house, the scene they encountered was beyond words, a horror that defied description. Olmsted County Sheriff Kevin Torgerson, who was a deputy at the time, often reflects on his 34-year career in law enforcement, with no case more impactful than February 18, 1988. With only 4 years of experience, 2 of which were in Rochester, he was dispatched to perform a welfare check at the Brom home. As the sun set around 5:23 p.m., Torgerson decided to wait for his backup before proceeding. Once his partner arrived, they knocked at the door, but there was no response. Torgerson and his partner carefully proceeded up the stairs. At the top, he saw the feet of 2 females lying on the floor. The sight confirmed their worst fears. As he stepped into Ricky's room, he found Ricky laying in bed in a fetal position, with severe head injuries and multiple other wounds, clutching a small blanket. But how and why did he do it?
I've got all the snapshots still in my head, and they're there, and the sensations, the smell, the different thoughts and the sounds that I was experiencing. I mean, they're right here. I can, they have never gone away.
The murders. On the evening of Wednesday, February 17, 1988, at around 11:30 p.m., David was hanging out in his bedroom when his father, Bernard, walked in and started threatening him. In the last few months, David had become more invested in the punk and heavy metal scene, and even had a music collection. It was this collection that Bernard threatened to take away if David didn't change his attitude. Whether this was related to the lifestyle David was delving into, or due to an incident about David's attitude earlier that day, is unclear. During this heated conversation, Bernard pushed David, causing him to fall backward onto a table. Overcome with fear and petrified of being struck again, David fled the room. At some point between 1:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. on Thursday, February 18th, David called a friend he had spoken to about the Florida trip and asked if she would skip school the next day if he were to murder his parents that night. After making the call, David returned to his bedroom and began listening to music again. During this time, he thought heavily about his situation and feelings, thinking about all the consequences before murdering his entire family. At about 3 a.m., David left his bedroom and headed towards the garage, tiptoeing through the family home, careful not to cause any noise that might wake his family. When David reached the garage, he carefully picked up a long-handled axe. At some point, he also picked up a steak knife. Armed with both, he entered the room where his parents were peacefully sleeping. David claimed he did not remember hitting anyone, but did recall a lot of screaming, not just from his victims, but also from himself. The aftermath. Afterwards, David was in his room, packing things like blankets. All the lights were on, and he had to go into each room. His brother was in his bedroom, and his mother and sister in the hall, with blood everywhere. David then called a friend immediately after the slaying and confessed everything to her. In just a matter of moments, David had murdered his father, Bernard Brom, who was 41 years old, his mother, Paulette Brom, who was also 41 years old, his little brother, Richard, known as Ricky, who was 11 years old, and his little sister Diane, who was 13 years old. David left the axe, the murder weapon, near the bottom of the basement stairs as he packed up his things. At about 3:30 a.m., shortly after committing the murders, David tried to phone another friend, but hung up when his friend's father answered. At some point afterwards, David took the family's van and drove to a local bank where he withdrew money using his mother's bank card. He then drove to a local supermarket where he bought cigarettes and snacks. Following this, David drove to a spot overlooking his friend's house so he could see when she left for school in the morning. When he saw her, she asked her to skip school. The two then drove to a nearby park where they hung out for a short while before driving to the bank where David withdrew more money.
In the middle of the night on February 18, 1988, 16-year-old David Brom killed 4 of his family members. His parents, Bernard and Paulette, and younger siblings, 14-year-old Diane and 9-year-old Rick, all murdered with an axe.
After leaving the park, David and his friend went to the friend's house, where the friend shaved the sides of David's head. The hair shaving didn't go well, so they decided to go to Kmart to purchase a razor. When they returned, David's friend finished the punk haircut David wanted, shaving the sides and creating a design with lines in the back. Shortly after, David had to hide in the friend's closet when the friend's mother unexpectedly came home. Once she left, the friend went back to school, and David drove to a different school where he met other friends for lunch. During lunch, he convinced one of these friends to dye his hair. The first attempt failed, so David went back to his family home to try again. The home, still containing the bodies of his murdered family, was where he dyed his hair downstairs. After dyeing his hair, David met up with another friend to return a book bag and said he was in deep trouble. He mentioned that he planned to sleep under a bridge that night and walk to the Twin Cities in the morning. At 5:23 p.m., concerned neighbors of the Brom family called the police and requested a welfare check. Following the call, 2 officers went to the Brom family home. They arrived shortly before 6 p.m. and found the front door closed but not locked. As they entered the house, they called out into the silence, but no one answered. When they made their way towards the stairs to the second floor, they were confronted with a gruesome scene. The entire Brom family was slaughtered, except for the eldest son, Joe, and David. A quick examination of the bodies revealed they were in a state of rigor mortis, which meant they had been dead for longer than 12 hours. Subsequently, the police issued a nationwide alert for David. They tracked down Joe Brom, the eldest sibling, who was working as a cook at a local restaurant, and informed him of his family's deaths. But David was nowhere to be seen. In the meanwhile, David was actually sighted by one of his teachers at a local shopping center that evening. The family's van, which David had been driving, was found by the authorities at about 11 p.m. near a Methodist hospital. David spent the night of that Thursday in a culvert near his home. At about 8:30 a.m. on Friday, February 19, 1988, a citizen saw David using a payphone at a post office and reported him to the police. He was then arrested inside the post office and brought in for questioning. The trial. As David was 16 years old at the time of his arrest, he was initially charged in the juvenile justice system. However, after a hearing, he was referred to be prosecuted as an adult.
Remember the reports?
The question Olmsted County authorities must decide now is whether to charge David Brom as a juvenile or as an adult.
Watch the Brom family murder story play out on national television.
Good evening. Topping tonight's News 11. Police charge a 16-year-old boy with 4 counts of first-degree murder after his family is found axed to death in their Rochester home.
The trial had 2 phases, as required by Minnesota law. The first phase focused on determining whether David was guilty of first- or second-degree murder in relation to the deaths of his parents and siblings. During this phase of David's trial, the defense sought to introduce expert psychiatric testimony to see if David was mentally fit, but the trial court denied this request, and as a result, the defense rested its case without presenting any testimony. The jury was told not to consider evidence of David's mental illness during Phase 1 deliberations. Despite this, the jury found David guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Moving to Phase 2 of the trial, David had to prove his legal insanity as the evidence was too strong. The defense presented testimony from a psychiatrist who concluded that David did not understand that killing his parents and siblings was wrong at the time of the murders, and argued he was legally insane. On the other hand, the state countered with testimony from 4 psychiatrists. 2 of these experts said that David was not legally insane during the murders, while the other 2 did not offer an opinion on his legal mental illness. All the experts agreed that David suffered from some form of mental illness or impairment, and even the psychiatrist who testified for the prosecution acknowledged that David was mentally ill and suggested that David may have killed his family to avoid committing suicide. David's older brother Joe had a verified alibi for the day of the murders, and forensic analysis revealed palm prints on the murder weapon matching David's prints. The trial concluded with Brom receiving 3 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 52 years before parole eligibility.
Good evening. David Brom is guilty. The jury reaffirmed its earlier decision and found Brom was sane when he killed his parents, younger brother, and sister with an axe. And that story tops tonight's News 11.
The jury deliberated more than 21 hours over 3 days before reaching the second verdict shortly before noon today.
Today's guilty verdict comes 20 months after the bodies of Brom's family were found in their suburban Rochester home and ends one of Minnesota's most publicized trials.
The case involving David Brom's murders still had attention months later, with speculation circulating about the possible influence of Negative Land, a Bay Area music group known for their satirical and critical content. Negative Land's music addresses topics such as mass media, nuclear war, and handguns, often using humor to convey their messages. But their song Christianity is Stupid became an important point of investigation, as the police wondered whether it sparked a dispute among the Brom family, potentially contributing to the tragic murders. Negative Land members expressed disbelief that their music, intended as satire, could have played any role in such a serious and tragic event. They were cooperative with federal authorities, who requested the group cancel their planned tour and refrain from live performances until the investigation concluded. What are your thoughts on David Brom's mental state during the time of the murders? Do you believe he was mentally fit to stand trial? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more videos like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. Take care and see you in the next one.